Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Mike Show, presented by Media U. Today we have a very special guest. He's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and co-founder of the mental health coaching group, Healthy Gamer. He streams on Twitch discussing mental health topics in the gaming space, and has had conversations with some of the most renowned streamers in the world, including Pokimane, Asmongold, and many, many others, and think that the community he has built has profoundly changed the streaming space. Please welcome Dr. Alok Kanojia, also known as Dr. K. Again, thanks so much. I've been watching a lot of your content lately, and I think Healthy Gamer and what you do is like cool, and it's very unique to the streaming space. Yeah, I'd love to just kind of begin with, how did you get started streaming? Like, what was the motivation to start streaming?
So when I was training to become a psychiatrist in residency, I was really curious about video game addiction. It was something that I had struggled with myself in college. And so started talking to a lot of the faculty where I was training, and just started asking them questions like, what do y'all think about video game addiction? And so I think these were very brilliant psychiatrists and leaders in the field of psychiatry, but it kind of clicked for me one day that I don't know if these people have ever played a video game, because some of the perspectives that they were offering didn't just seem to fit with me. So I think that if you look at the proposed diagnostic criteria for video game addiction, it's essentially the same as alcohol addiction, with alcohol replaced by the word video game. And my experience of it had been that this is actually like a new thing. It doesn't work exactly like a substance use disorder. So I started working with gamers. And after working with gamers for a couple of years, I started to realize that a lot of what they need is not necessarily therapy, but just like understanding. Like, there's just so many basics about how technology interfaces with your mind that we don't understand as a society. And what I really found is that in my office, I was having the same conversations over and over and over again about general principles and educating people, as opposed to like person-specific stuff, like talking about their childhood or things like that. And so then I started to wonder, can I have a public conversation that can benefit a lot of people? Because can I just teach about these concepts? And that's how we started streaming.
And you yourself had problems with video game addiction in college, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it probably started to impact my life actually in high school, and then almost failed out of college. So was on academic probation after my first year, had less than a 2.0 GPA, literally failed half of my classes. Wow. And so the second year wasn't much better, but was a little bit better. And so really struggled with it. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. When I was a junior in high school, I took my first psychology class, and I was playing a lot of World of Warcraft at the time. And for our final project, I actually did a project about how like World of Warcraft like trains you to be more and more addicted to it by giving you little small rewards throughout the time, and then you finally get the big rewards. And my psychology teacher, I think, gave me a C- because he thought I was just blowing off the project to play more WoW.
Wow. Yeah, you were ahead of your time in noticing that.
I appreciate that. After college, right, you went and you studied to be a monk, right?
Yeah, so that actually started during college. So after my second year of college, things were just not working. So my parents were very supportive in a lot of ways, like were very loving and tried to help me. And they tried to punish me. They tried, tough love. They tried not tough love. They tried everything, and they couldn't really figure out what to do or what was wrong. They felt like I was kind of off track. And so my dad actually recommended that I spend some time in an ashram in India the summer after my second year of college, which I did, and absolutely fell in love with it. So I really enjoyed my experience there and decided at the end of the summer that I wanted to be a monk.
Wow. That's super cool. And you've brought a lot of those techniques of like meditation and like vatas and stuff into what you treat. I don't know if I'm using that word right.
Yeah,
but into your kind of your programs at Healthy Gamer, right?
Yeah. So I think a lot of what I discovered there was like, so in the West, we have formal education in subjects like mathematics, science. So like every kid is taught mathematics and science. But even if you look at our formal study of psychology, we don't teach you about you. We teach you about general principles of like populations, right? So people are more likely to ABC as opposed to very practical education about why is it hard to wake up in the morning? Why is it hard? Why do people get motivated in the middle of the night or like at 10 p.m. as opposed to like first thing in the morning? And why do we get these bursts of energy at different times of the day? And so what I really discovered in India was like a very like formal education in the self. So how does a human being work? Where do thoughts come from? What's the relationship between thoughts and actions? Where do desires come from? How does one overcome your desires? Why do we give in to our desires? Just all that basic stuff. And I thought it was fantastic. And so that's really what we try. We take that approach of like understand yourself in a very like practical way if you want to improve your life.
So how did you transition to like having this idea that you wanted to reach out to more people to just like going live on Twitch? Was that the first platform you started streaming on, or what was the process of like the idea to execution?
Yeah, so I started to wonder, can I help more people than in my office? And part of the reason that I started wondering that is because I was getting more and more referrals in my office. So like I'd gotten maybe like 300 referrals over the course of about 6 to 8 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So like, I guess word sort of got out that there's a guy who helps with this kind of thing. And so I started to really think about this, not really in terms of like a clinical problem, but a public health problem. And so like, how can we approach this from like a population standpoint, as opposed to, there's no way I'm going to get through everyone in my office. The other thing that I really felt was urgency, because I talked to my mentors at like Mass General Hospital and McLean Hospital, which are wonderful people. And they did a beautiful job of kind of laying out for me what a career in this looks like. They were like, okay, you should, apply for a research grant. That'll take you like 3 to 5 years. You're going to like publish studies about it. You're going to study it. You're going to figure out effective treatments. You can start a clinic. They sort of laid out for me like a beautiful 10-year plan. And at the 10-year mark, we would have really good tools to like help people with video game addiction. And what I remember and what I sort of felt from the people that I'd worked is like people can't wait 10 years for a solution, even if it is like the most beautifully produced solution. And so there was a real sense of urgency that people, their lives are being ruined one semester at a time. And people can't wait 10 years, let alone 10 months, and let alone 10 weeks. Like people need help today. And so that's sort of where I started thinking a little bit about a big principle that I also appreciated from my training is meet people where they're at. So as part of my training, there's this awesome part of residency that we do, which is called like a street team, which is mental health care delivered to primarily the homeless population. And what you literally do is you like walk around Boston and you run into people and you try to help them because they can't come to a clinic for whatever reason. They're not organized enough. They're not focused enough. They can't afford transportation to the clinic. Their device that has their calendar gets stolen. There are all kinds of challenges. So that was really formative for me, as well as working in jails. So sometimes like one of the principles I learned is you got to take it to where people are at, as opposed to having people come to you. Because a lot of people who struggle with video game addiction don't go see a psychiatrist, right? They stay at home.
Yeah, they play more video games.
Absolutely. So we started on Twitch because that's where my people are and the people that I was trying to help. And by my people, I mean gamers.
Mm-hmm. Right. It seems like there's a trend of like healthy gamer and you want to be a doctor. Like have you always had this desire inside of you to help others, or did you always want to be a doctor, or was there other things you looked at when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is, did I always want to be a doctor? No, I pretended to want to be a doctor for a lot of my life.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I think like, for example, like I was pre-med when I started college. Both my parents are doctors. And so what I noticed as a second generation immigrant is that there's the respectable professions and then there's the less respectable professions. So, there are a lot of people within the Indian diaspora that are doctors, especially here in the US, because they're the ones that were able to easily leave India. And so I was pre-med starting out, but I think I was just I didn't really care about helping people. I just thought that this was a good thing, and it pays well, and it brings you prestige, because I saw when my parents were like, I'm a doctor, like people would treat them with respect. And I was like, oh, I want those things. So at the very beginning, it was very, very ego driven in terms of my desire to become a doctor, which is I didn't really care about it, which is why I didn't really study, right? I was doing it for appearances and money and those kinds of reasons. But technically I was pre-med, and then later went to India. And then I really decided to become a doctor almost kind of like based on one of my gurus in India. I told him I wanted to become a monk, and I was like, I'm ready to give up my life and devote myself to spirituality and stuff. And he was he didn't say it quite like this, but he's like, what are you giving up? You have nothing worth giving up. Like you have nothing, you're not giving anything up. And what he accurately assessed was that I was running away as opposed to really giving something up. And he was like, if you want to forsake your life, you have to have a life worth forsaking. So he told me to go build a life and then give it up. So he said, we'll take you when you're 30. Like, you could still come back and continue to study and stuff, but we're not going to let you take your vows until you're about 30 and you've completed a doctoral degree. He was like, anything that you're going to do here is going to be harder than achievement in the material world. So go achieve in the material world, do the absolute best that you can, and then give it all up when you're 30, and then we'll take you. So it's like, wow. Okay.
And through that process, you kind of develop this sense of like actually wanting to help people and find that desire and kind of kill your ego a little bit.
Yeah, so they did a good job of knocking the ego out as well as like the spiritual practices, right? And then I started to discover, I actually didn't want to be a doctor ever, and I am running away from life. And so I was like, if I want to give things up, I have to achieve them first. That was kind of my realization. So I really focused on, well, if I have to get a doctoral degree, like which one do I want to do the most? And I was really somewhat interested in medicine at that point. Like I thought it was kind of a good field. And frankly, one of the major reasons I picked it is because it's the hardest. So just statistically, like if you get a doctoral degree, like medicine is the most competitive.
Why did that inform your decision?
Because my teacher had told me that anything that you do in the spiritual world is going to be like harder than achievement in the material world. I'm not saying that that's correct or incorrect. And so I was like, okay, let me just pick it was sort of arbitrary, to be honest, at the beginning. And then as I got more into it, as I failed to get into medical school year after year after year, I started to really wonder about, okay, is this really what I want to do? Like, I can probably get into a PhD program somewhere. And then the more I really started to like think about it, the more I realized I actually am really interested in medicine.
Cool. Wow. So you kind of just tried it, and through the process, you developed that passion.
Yeah. And I think that's what's kind of confusing, is that you can't really, in my opinion, you can't really develop a passion for medicine until you start doing it. Right. So like if you look at a pre-med, like what do they really know about medicine? They don't know anything. And you can go and like shadow in a clinic, but I really fell in love with medicine after I started. And I would even say like, my second year of medical school was really fantastic in a lot of ways. And then my end of third year and fourth year of medical school is really when I started to love it, because then I understood what it was. And I was like, hey, this is actually really amazing.
Cool. Wow. Yeah. So I was watching one of your videos recently. I think it was about motivation. And in that video, you said something that really, I didn't understand at first, but you were saying that you personally don't have long-term goals. In that video, you said that. You say you just wake up every day, see what you need to do, and you do it. But how can you, Healthy Gamer had to have been somewhat of a long-term goal, no?
No. Why do you assume that it was a long-term goal?
Well, maybe not like 10 years, but like it's got to be at least like a year of planning or something like that, right?
I know this is going to sound bizarre, but no. So there's certainly planning involved, but I think the planning is reverse engineered from like kind of the main step that we're moving towards. So it's not like we don't have a goal and we're completely disorganized kind of thing. But for example, so like my first thought was, okay, how do I help more people? Because I can't get to everyone in my office. So I was like, okay, let's try streaming on Twitch. And then I was like, as I thought about Twitch, I certainly went through a lot of like due process, right? So I was looking a little bit, like I reviewed Twitch contracts and things like that. I also spoke to attorneys and things like that about, spoke to my mentors and supervisors about, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing. What do y'all think? They gave me a lot of like really, really good advice about, things to be careful of. And so I definitely did my diligence, but then it's like we start streaming on Twitch. And when I started out streaming on Twitch, I didn't anticipate having a company. I didn't anticipate having, I think I may have incorporated, actually, we may have incorporated by that point, but so we did some like due diligence there, but that was just to separate out my clinical practice from the entity that does Twitch. So some diligence there, but it wasn't like we were planning on becoming a thing, right? It was just like, I'm going to try to help. If 5 people show up, that's a win in my book. And I have no idea where this is going to go. Like, I've never seen a psychiatrist on Twitch. I've never heard of a psychiatrist on Twitch. So it's not like I want to be Dr. K. And I didn't even come up with that, by the way. It's just people didn't know how to pronounce my name, so people just started calling me Dr. K.
Oh, wow, that's funny.
And I know it sounds kind of bizarre, but like, do we move towards stuff? Yeah, but I think it is a big difference. That one of the big things that I learned in India is like we attach ourselves to some kind of fiction. And the big problem with plans is that we make them at the beginning, but the beginning is when we understand the least.
Right.
Right. And I'd kind of experienced that. I was planning on becoming an oncologist when I was 17 years old, and I had set that goal. Right. And of course, like if someone asked me like, okay, where do you want to become an oncologist? I was like, Harvard Medical School is where I'm going to go. And then little old me with a 1.0 GPA has all these plans and goals. And I realized that's all like, useless. So as I learned to kind of focus on the present and really focus on, okay, like how can I help people today? And that's really our compass. And then even as the company has evolved, like what started happening when I started streaming is it started to grow. And then as it grew, instead of having 300 referrals, it went up to 1,000, 5,000, and even at one point, 10,000 people a month.
Oh my God.
And so then the question is like, all right, so all these people are asking for help. How can I help them? And that's actually where our coaching program was born. So then someone asked me, I went to my supervisors and colleagues and stuff, and I was like, I'm getting a ton of referrals a month. What do I do? And one of them laughed and said, well, you can't do anything unless you can duplicate yourself. And they were saying it as a joke, right? So they were basically like, there's nothing you can do. Like, there's no way you can see 10,000 people. And then I started wondering, I was like, oh, hold on a second. Am I really that special? Or is what I do to help people, can a portion of this be taught? And so started to research that and really discovered, for example, the United Nations, World Health Organization, Office of the U.S. Surgeon General are really talking about peer support models of mental health. And I definitely seen it in my clinical practice. So I was wondering, okay, can I teach people in a peer support kind of fashion to help each other? And the answer turned out to be yes.
Wow.
But I don't think that we started out, wanting to have a YouTube channel, wanting to have a coaching program, wanting to have like Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. All of those things have come out of what we see that the community needs. I don't know if that makes more sense in terms of, so we didn't like plan that stuff on day zero.
Right. It's almost like you have a tiny glimmer of a plan, but every day you're reevaluating, kind of.
Yeah. So I would say that, we have an idea like based on needs. So the community will tell us, hey, we need this. That's what I'll observe. And so based on that, I'll like form a plan. But that plan is usually like less than a year. Okay. So like if we need to duplicate Dr. K, like how do we go about doing that? And then as we did that worked really well. And then we started getting like different kinds of other responses. Like parents would reach out to us. And they're like, can you help me with my kid? And so then what we did is we sort of expanded and then we tried to figure out, okay, like, well, I can't help all these parents. So can we teach coaches to help parents? And then we sort of developed parent coaching.
Right.
So it's really kind of responding to the needs of our community and kind of like what the digital generation is looking for.
Did the community come up with the idea of doing coaching, or was that you?
No, that was me. So the community came up with the need. right? The need is 10,000 people are reaching out to me this month to enter into my private practice, and I can't help all of them. So then the question is, okay, like, how do you help? If you're one individual and a lot of people want your help and you can't reach them, what do you do? Well, can you teach what you do to other people? So that was like the core idea. And then the question was, okay, do I go in and teach? So I was still teaching at Harvard Medical School at that time, which I made a continuing education course for the American Psychiatric Association. I was teaching at Harvard Medical School. So I was doing that kind of teaching. But once again, the problem was urgency. So I could teach this stuff and do research and stuff like that. But if I teach a course to, let's say, an intern in residency, it's going to take 4 years before they even can help anyone with that course.
Right. So how long do you train your coaches?
So it's about 10 weeks.
Every day?
Yeah. So it's like an asynchronous training. So there's like different kinds of things that happen. But, so it starts out with like education. And then there's like skills building and role playing and things like that. And then there's like a certifying coach period where they're working with clients, but have a very small number of clients and a lot more education. And I think that's a really good model. So even in my clinical experience, I felt like I learned the most medicine once I started seeing patients. And even if you look at things like postdocs and stuff like that, I think we're sort of recognizing that, you can go to culinary school, and then like once you do some kind of apprenticeship is when you really learn how to cook.
Yeah.
And we're sort of seeing a shift in education towards more practical stuff earlier. And there's also a lot of science that suggests that you will learn book knowledge better if you have some kind of real life scenario that you can apply it to in the moment.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. And I think I saw in one of your other videos, you were talking about how your coaching program has kind of adapted as well as you've gone through it, because you're doing like scientific research on all this stuff, right? Like you're kind of incorporating this into research.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we brought to, and I think that's part of the reason that we have really good outcomes. Like we just presented our outcomes at the American Psychiatric Association national meeting this past May. And so one of the key things is this is something I learned in med school and residency is like, okay, I may think this is a good idea and I may think I'm brilliant and I may do a lot of research, but me being brilliant and doing a lot of research, right, which is the brilliant one is even questionable, is doesn't actually mean it's going to work. To actually know, because why am I doing this? I'm doing this to actually help people, right? And so how am I going to know if I help people? It's not good enough to say, hey, do you feel like we helped you? And they say, yeah, like I really enjoyed it. So that's where we started measuring outcomes. So we have, I think, currently 5 IRB approved studies that we're running, or research projects. And so we collect outcomes, right? So we did a pilot and we were like, okay, we started with like 8 coaches, maybe like 40 clients or something like that. So we started with like a pilot and we were like, okay, can 8 people help working with 5 clients each? Can y'all actually make a difference? And the initial data looked good. And so then we expanded, we did kind of like, larger batches and more clients. And then over time, we've actually revised the curriculum 8 or 9 times over 3 years.
Oh, wow.
And that's all based on data.
And is this data accessible? Like, can you read these research studies or are they kind of in progress still?
Hopefully soon. So we had our first presentation of data, like I said, at the APA meeting this past year. So that maybe you can find on the APA website, but and we're submitting our data it's undergoing peer review for publication, like depending on which project you're talking about. So we've had one thing that it's been under review for actually about a year and seems to be quite slow because of pandemic related stuff. But hopefully it'll be coming out soon.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to read those.
Yeah.
All this stuff is super interesting. I mean, I feel like you are, I said this at the beginning, but you are a very unique figure in the Twitch space. Like, I don't think anyone is doing research studies on Twitch and doing all this other stuff. Do you ever feel like, I know you call yourself a boomer a lot in the Twitch space, but do you ever feel like a disconnect from the space being so much older or being kind of in a different world? And
yeah, I mean, from day one, So I think that, but I don't consider the disconnect a bad thing, if that kind of makes sense. Like, I've just acknowledged that I'm not going to understand half of what's going on Twitch. Every year that goes by, I'm going to understand less and less, and that's okay. And so part of what I love about Twitch is that Twitch helps me understand. So it's like, if I don't understand something, which is happening more and more, I will literally, like, I want to say at least once a week or maybe once every other week, I'll just ask Twitch. I'm like, hey, you guys are using this word that I've never heard before, or everyone is using a particular emote. What does this emote mean?
Yeah.
And so am I disconnected? Like 100%. But I think that kind of disconnection doesn't mean that I'm not one of them and we're not all kind of in it together.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because you've talked to a lot of the biggest streamers in the space, and so you've, in a lot of ways, connected with more streamers than probably a lot of the biggest streamers. But at the same time, you're approaching it in a different way.
Yeah, so I think when we talk to streamers, I love talking to people about their experiences of life. And this is where, a lot of times, like, since I know how to talk to people will sort of like think that this is therapy. Therapy actually looks quite different. And what I really want to do is just talk to people about their experiences. And I think what's happening on the internet is we're becoming more and more divorced from authenticity. Like, we're moving away from authenticity on the internet. And you can see this in terms of like filters and like everyone just has to be on all the time and stuff like that. And I think that what I really appreciate about everyone who's been a guest on our channel is that they've given us an insight into what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Because I think we're losing that.
Do you think that there's conversely, like, some danger in being authentic on the internet? I mean, being a little too open about things? And
I mean, there certainly can be, right? So I think that, and that's why, so for example, like, anytime someone comes on stream, like, people don't really see this part, but we have a private boundary setting call ahead of time where they get to, like, draw the lines of what is okay to talk about and what's not okay to talk about.
Yeah.
So we've got, like, a process in place to try to keep people from, sharing too much or if there's a particular part that they don't want to talk about. So everyone kind of has that opportunity.
Yeah.
I think that what we do see is a lot of, like, sharing of personal information on the internet. We'll see a lot of trauma dumping, things like that. And I think that absolutely can be dangerous, right? So people will share their addresses. I've heard horror stories about grooming and things like that, so we've got to be careful with what you share.
Yeah, because I've seen some streamers or even YouTubers, other personalities, like, they're pretty open at the beginning, and then later on down their career, they're like, man, I wish I didn't share this because I wish, this is giving people too many attack vectors, or it just gives a little too much of myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have to be careful because people will attack you with whatever they can. Yeah. Thankfully, I think for the majority of people who we've talked to on the internet, like, they seem to be doing pretty okay with all of it. Like, we'll check in with people sometimes afterward, or, they'll give us feedback. Sometimes people will request that we take their video down, which we always do. And streamers or just community members.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up, because a lot of your content too is not only talking to, bigger streamers or whatever, but just random people in your community that come to you with problems. And I've noticed a lot of those videos even tend to have more views or more positive feedback, because it seems even a little more authentic in some ways, because, streamers have to put on a face and a persona.
Yeah, I think a lot of my favorite interactions are with community members. So I think there are just really bizarre things that have come out of our work. So we did a stream where we were talking to a group of men about pornography addiction. And I was thinking, like, especially for such a memeable topic, like, this can get out of control. And also, if you look at some things like the YouTube comment section, right, which can sometimes be a really dark place.
Oh, I bet.
And I was thinking, like, for sure, like a YouTube comment section about a group of dudes talking about porn and jerking off will be, the worst corner of the internet.
Yeah.
And what I'm really amazed by is it's like this space of like positivity and encouragement, and like it's like one of the best corners of the internet that I've ever visited.
Wow.
And it's really bizarre, like, because it's stuff that you normally wouldn't consider, like you wouldn't consider going to the YouTube comment section of a video about pornography addiction to be a place where you can be inspired or uplifted. But that's what that is. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I watched a little bit of that video, and I actually did see the comments, and everyone was like,
"Yeah,
you guys are badass. Like, what balls these guys must have, like, saying all this stuff live."
And these are people who have carried shame around with them from a very young age. Mm-hmm. And for them to be like authentic and like inspiring other people, that's just not what you expect when you carry around all that shame. And that's the big lesson that we've learned, which is that, mental health and mental illness are not things that you need to carry alone. And that we can kind of come together and support each other as a community, use tools like peer support to discuss traditionally taboo topics, because everyone is suffering from it. And we're not talking about it. And even if you look statistically, I think like every field of medicine is essentially improving in terms of outcomes. Like people are getting better at heart transplants and lung transplants and kidney transplants, right? We can like literally take someone has a non-functional organ and we can stick a new one in them and keep them alive for 10 to 20 years. The one place that we're losing ground is mental health. It's the one place where outcomes are actually getting worse year after year.
Right. Yeah. I've noticed a lot of people in my life, when you like bring up the topic of mental health or be like, maybe you should get a therapist, it's like, yeah, they kind of shut down. I think it is correlated to what you're talking about with shame. And that's another reason I think all the content you're putting out is so important, because being able to just talk about this stuff up. I mean, I've shared your videos actually with people I know that like, have problems with motivation. I'm like, hey, this guy just made a video about motivation. It's really cool. One of the other things that you've done with Healthy Gamer is your guide to mental health, right?
Yeah.
And so that is accessible through Discord, correct?
Yeah, I think at the end of the month, it's going to be accessible outside of Discord. But
okay.
Right now it's Discord.
Cool. And the topics that you cover on that are meditation, depression, anxiety, and you just released a topic about ADD, right?
Yeah. So, the guide to mental health, once again, kind of came out of community stuff. So we developed a coaching program. And what we noticed is that the coaches are really good at particular skills, and they can help people with things like motivation. So we sort of see, for example, like a 58% increase in sense of purpose or direction in life at about the 12-week mark in coaching. And that's really important for a lot of other reasons that I can kind of get into. But that's actually our main focus, is kind of giving people like direction and motivation and being able to accomplish their goals and things like that. But one of the things that the coaches can't do is offer like expertise on particular subjects, right? So they haven't gone and studied to become a monk for 7 years. They haven't gone to medical school and things like that. So what we sort of realized is the coaching program was kind of missing a certain amount of like expert information or high quality like information or knowledge, which is where the guide to mental health came from. And it's basically, the way that I structured it was when someone comes into my office, I essentially have like a branching logic in my mind about how to talk to them. So I'll sort of like assess them clinically, but sometimes when someone comes in and says, I'm depressed, I don't think it's actually a clinical illness. I think it's sometimes like a lack of direction in life, like, having lived your entire life, trying to live up to others' expectations. So much like myself, majored in pre-med, became a doctor, became a surgeon because it's respectable and pays a lot. And then you're 45 years old, you're in a career that you don't enjoy. You're now married and have a couple of kids. and like you don't know what to do with yourself because this is not the life that you wanted. You did everything right and you wound up in the wrong place. So when that person comes into my office and says, hey, I'm depressed, I'll kind of do a clinical assessment, but oftentimes it'll be like more of almost like a spiritual kind of discussion. And so what the guides really try to do is kind of share my perspective or how I think about things like depression. And there's a clinical branch to that, but the Guide to Depression, for example, draws a lot on some of these Eastern concepts like dharma or karma or other things like that. How do you find a purpose in life? The ADHD guide, for example, is not actually, a third of it is about ADD or ADHD from a clinical standpoint. And then the other 2/3 of the guide is really my favorite part, which is doing stuff, which is like, how do we understand how to do stuff? So when we struggle to do something, what's happening in our brain, what's happening in our mind, because those are two separate things. How can you develop tools to be able to like do stuff? And we were struggling with the name because we're like, is this motivation? Well, it's not motivation. Motivation's a piece of it. Is it like how to get organized? It's not really that. What is it? And then in a meeting, we were just like, well, it's like basically how to do stuff. And that's what the name became. So it really teaches people, like when I'm working with someone and they're struggling to do stuff, it's kind of like a step-by-step approach to like how to start doing things.
Very cool. Very cool. And I noticed, because I signed up for it and I looked at the guide. I haven't really gone through it, but it's kind of, the layout kind of looks like a skill tree in like a video game. Is that intentional, or was that more of like the branches of your psychological?
Oh, no, that's absolutely intentional. I mean, it was inspired by games because I was kind of thinking about it as competencies, right? So like for example, the Guide to Doing Stuff, there's like a section on like operationalizing. So, if you think about trying to accomplish something, if your mind can organize what needs to be done, like let's say packing for a trip, then you can do it. But if you think about what's the difference between packing for a trip and moving from one home to another, one is operationally way more difficult and has way more steps. And so how do you break complex tasks down into individual steps? Because there's like, that's one section of the guide, but that's completely different from understanding your own ego and what motivates you. And those are both in the guide. So why am I moving to this home in the first place? Well, I want to impress people. And I've wanted to impress people my entire life, which makes me make decisions, affects my behavior. How can I understand that? And instead of starting to live to make other people happy, how can I discover what I want and move in that direction? So we kind of cover, like you kind of said, it's sort of like a skill tree. And like, these are, having worked with, hundreds of people at this point, this is what I've discovered. Like, if you want to accomplish something in your life, what you need to do is not only the concrete tools, but also like some amount of introspection and self-understanding, and even some degree of like what we would consider spirituality, as well as understanding the neuroscience of attention. That's kind of how it's like we're going to check all these boxes.
Right. Yeah, I saw in one of your videos you were talking about how the mind can't focus on multiple things at a time. And a lot of motivation is just being able to keep one thought present in your mind, which kind of relates to meditation and training your mind to focus like that.
Right. So I remember when I was a kid, I always got the feedback that I need to focus more. Like, I would do so much better. I would live up to my potential if I could focus more. And my parents would tell me to focus more. My teachers would tell me to focus more, but no one ever taught me how to focus. They just said, you need to be better at it. They never sat me down and said, here is how you get your mind to focus on one thing for an extended period of time. And that's what I loved about India, is like, they were like, hey, here, by the way, here's how you ride a bicycle, except the bicycle is your mind. Here's how you get your mind to go in the direction that you want it to go. Which they don't teach us. Like, we don't teach that. It's ridiculous.
What do you think the relationship to like the Western medicine incorporating some of these ideas of like Ayurveda and meditation and yoga and all this stuff? Like, do you think it's become a little more receptive to those kind of ideas, or is it still kind of just like East versus West? Or
I would say yes and no. So my original plan when I was going to medical school was to focus on evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine. So in a bizarre way, you could even say that video game addiction is like not actually my traditional area of expertise. It's really on evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine. And I think Western medicine is adopting some of it. Some of it has been kind of kicking and screaming. So like people have advocated for meditation as being a useful tool to improve physical and mental health for like literally thousands of years. And about 60 or 70 years ago is when, TM, for example, transcendental meditation kind of hit the West. And you had a bunch of people doing it. But even the psychiatric community was very, very anti-meditation. That was also right around the time of the development of the first SSRI or antidepressant medication. So there was a big push towards like making psychiatry more biological and things like that.
And you think that's why they were kind of resistant to meditation and stuff? It's because they were focusing on more of a biological drug approach?
I think they were resistant to it, yes, because they were discovering some stuff in the brain that was kind of scientific. But I think the other reason they're resistant to it is, frankly, arrogance, which we still have, which is that, so for example, like we have these ideas of the mind that were based on Sigmund Freud, and it's hard to even realize that this is just, we think this is the way that the mind is, right? Because that the whole tradition of psychoanalysis, psychotherapy is based on a couple of these core ideas, and we kind of developed stuff. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, but there's just sort of this idea that this is better.
Right.
And then what started happening is therapists started meditating. And then what started happening is some of these therapists started meditating, people went to therapy, and what they really discovered was that meditation added something. And so now we're seeing a big revitalization in the field of medicine, especially towards meditation. But I don't think we quite have the appetite for some of the other stuff yet, which I think is like reasonable, because basically what medicine does is we're kind of skeptical as a field, which is really good. And so we don't want to start recommending something until we study it.
Yeah.
I think the real shortcoming is that when we make something studyable, we remove a lot of its value. So, for example, if you look at like meditation has been used to help people alleviate suffering for thousands of years. But when you protocolize it into mindfulness, what you lose is a lot of the, in my mind, kind of therapeutic value, because we have to figure out, okay, like how are we going to study meditation? Because there's one dude over here who's doing this technique, one dude over here who's doing this technique. And then what we tried to kind of do is turn it into processed it into fast food, which is kind of what mindfulness is, right? It's a universal term that everyone kind of teaches. It has the core components of mindfulness. But the interesting thing is that if you really look at mindfulness, mindfulness isn't even meditation. So if you look at the Sanskrit term mindfulness, it's actually the first stage of meditation. It's the preparatory stage of meditation. And so some of these nuances, that there's actually a lot of therapeutic value. So if you look at transformative or cathartic spiritual experiences, mindfulness is not going to get you there usually. You need some other kinds of techniques, which, people have had. So they'll be like transformed by some experience that's spiritual in nature. But getting to that level is like difficult to protocolize and study.
Yeah.
So we kind of have this tension between what's easy to study versus like the easier we make it to study, the more we standardize it, the more value we tend to lose.
That makes sense. Yeah, before your videos, I honestly didn't even know there were multiple types of meditation. But then I saw the alternate nostril breathing thing. That was like really cool. I tried that on one of your videos, and that was really cool.
So I think that's a great point, Mike, because that's actually exactly the problem, is that we have taught such a specific kind of meditation. We've kind of standardized it into apps and things like that, which aren't bad. I mean, I think it's good because it's easier for people to meditate. But I don't think that like 95% of people who meditate and even teach meditation or teach mindfulness, for example, really understand like that, the roots of the practice. They just teach what they were taught.
Yeah, and I think that's how you talk about in a similar video. Like that's a problem you have with a lot of these gurus, is like these gurus, regardless of whether they're enlightened or not, are taught a certain way, and that way might not be the way for whoever they're training.
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of clarify that, it's not that I have a problem with them. It's just that when I was learning meditation, I wasn't all in on any particular guru. And so what I ended up doing is studying it, let's say, like I studied at ashrams in India predominantly, but also like Zen Buddhist monasteries in Japan, South Korea, things like that. So I over those 7 years, I went to a lot of different places to learn a lot of different kinds of meditation. And much like medication, not one medication works for everyone. And I think what we're seeing in the West is these lineages where there's like, someone who knows a lot about meditation. And then since what we love in the West is certification courses, right? Because like this is bizarre, but like in ancient Zen monasteries, for example, to become a teacher of Zen meditation, on average, took 30 years.
Oh my God.
And at the end of 30 years, you don't necessarily even become a teacher. Like, so based on your spiritual progress, right? Which is like, it's not just showing up every day, it's doing the work in your head. And then the master would basically say like, okay, this person is a master now, or they'd say, you're not.
Wow.
And
these guys must have been pissed.
well, so they actually weren't, because that was normal. There was no expectation of entitlement that if I pay money and I show up in class every day, that I will be a teacher. And,
wow.
and that's how our educational system is, right? So like just because you go get an MBA does not make you a stellar entrepreneur.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But so traditional meditation teachers had to be stellar entrepreneurs before they gave you the MBA. So you'd take like 100 people, and over the course of your education, all 100 of you have to start companies. And those of you that launch a successful company that has X net worth, those are the people that we're going to give the MBA to. And it's completely reverse here, where what we tend to do is like, so you can get a certification because 8-week course and you get certified, which is good. I mean, you can teach, it's standardized, like there are advantages to that, which is that there's a minimum level of competence. But the downside is that what ends up happening is someone, goes and gets certified as a meditation teacher, but they get certified in a particular path. And then when they get students, if that student struggles, the teacher says, try this technique harder, try this technique harder, try this technique harder. And then what I hear from a lot of people is that they give up on meditation because they're like, I can't meditate. It's not for me. But I think the reason that they come to that conclusion, and that's really my issue with this whole thing, I'm not trying to fault people because, if you want to learn meditation, go take a certification course and by all means start teaching people. I'm not saying that that's bad. But I think it's incomplete. And the most dangerous thing is that I think that model sometimes drives people away from meditation. Because the teacher doesn't tell them, hey, by the way, this kind of technique may not work for you. Maybe you should try something else, right? Like if you don't like Italian food, like maybe there's a Mexican place down the street, like check that out.
Right.
But that's not what we see.
And would you say that there is a form of meditation that will work for, like, is there anyone out there that meditation just won't work for, even regardless of what form or style?
I do not think so. So if you look at it if you really look at it, meditation is a particular way that we work with our mind, basically, really to transcend mind. And I think that being able to transcend mind is, generally speaking, maybe in some severe neurologic cases, that may not be the case. That's really the only thing I can think of. Like if someone has cerebral palsy or a particular kind of cerebral palsy, or has like really bad strokes or things like that, it may be difficult for them to partake in some kinds of meditation. And I've seen situations like that, as a medical doctor. But generally speaking, I think that, meditation is focusing your mind and then transcending the mind, which you can do watching a sunset.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about there are certain spiritual moments that people like walking on the beach, watching a sunset, where you get pretty close. Like a lot of times people will describe runner's high. So people who run a lot and, do cross country and marathons and stuff like that, they'll describe these very meditative states. Rock climbers, diving, sensory deprivation tanks. There are a lot of ways that we can kind of step beyond mind. And I think that finding the right technique is really the goal.
Yeah. That's super cool. Yeah, I mean, meditation seems to be kind of like this little hack of just like hacking your brain to be able to function a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's what people have turned it into, right? So even in clinical medicine, we think about it as a treatment for depression or anxiety, which is not really ever what it was designed to do. It just happens to fix all those things along the way.
Gotcha. So going back a little bit to Healthy Gamer and your organization, a lot of what we're trying to do with this podcast is kind of show a little bit behind the scenes of like content creators and stuff. Obviously, you have a team at Healthy Gamer. How did you like find this team, and like how did it grow over time? Like, was it people in your community? Did you like put out flyers or online ads? And
yeah, so I mean, I think the short answer is one person at a time, like literally. And we did start with like certain community members. So when I first started streaming on Twitch, there were a group of people. We started like meeting once a week on Discord, and I would teach meditation and stuff like that. And then there were probably less than 30 people in our community at that point. I want to say that a dozen people were pretty regular in our like weekly like meditation group or whatever. And so as people started getting benefit, people started offering, hey, can I help? So we had, some people helping, but one of the key things that I was very, very focused on early, I'd also done a fair amount of like nonprofit work. And so one of the things that I felt was really important is that, if people do good work, they should be compensated for it. Right. And so we had a lot of people who were willing to volunteer, but we kind of didn't go that route. And so we started, with people in our community who were like really good at particular things. And then as our needs expanded, we, found other people. Now we'll post jobs like on job boards and things like that for various roles. So it's kind of really like one person at a time. Where
what was the first job you hired for? Like a producer, editor, graphics person?
Yeah. So I think our first hire was maybe in April of 2020. And was like a content producer. And so it was like someone to really like handle because that's really most of what we were at that point, right? So we were like Twitch and YouTube and things like that.
So were you editing that yourself at that point, or was your producer kind of handling
so
that?
I have never edited a YouTube video. We may not have even had a YouTube channel actually at that point. I'm not even sure. So, but yeah, so, we started out maybe with volunteers and quickly moved to contractors for kind of like paid gigs and things like that. And then first full-time hire was April 2021. And then we added on other people as our needs grew.
How big is your team at the moment? Or, I'm sure you have people coming in and out.
So we have about 110 coaches across, I want to say 12 to 15 countries.
Oh, wow.
And then we've got staff of around 20.
Wow, that's pretty significant for a content creator on Twitch. How does that feel, like having such a big team? I mean, because you said going in, you had no expectations. Like if you're like, if I have 5 viewers, that's great. But now you literally have hundreds of people.
Yeah. I know it's going to sound weird, Mike, but it doesn't feel any different.
Really?
Like, yeah. I mean, it's just, it's like you wake up today and it's like you do what you got to do. So for a period of about 18 months, our coaching program was full, like 100, like we had a waiting list of like over 1,000 people. So it's like, okay, so, I wake up and it's like, okay, coaching program is full. That goes on for months and months and months and months and months. And we're kind of surprised, right? Because at some point, like, it's not going to be full.
Yeah.
But when we've got, people have been on, there's 1,000 person waiting list. That is, people have been waiting for a year to get into coaching. Okay, like let's find some more coaches. And so, and then recently, for example, like, we may be hiring a second customer support person or something like that. I'm not entirely sure, but, and so it's just, it's just kind of like one step at a time. It's like, okay, well, what do we need today? Okay, we need more coaches. And as the number of coaches grew, we needed like more people to handle like the administration of coaches. And then like, as we added on people from different countries, we needed like additional legal expertise or tax expertise. And so it's kind of weird, but it kind of popped up like a mushroom, like, one mushroom after another all around me. But from a day-to-day basis, it doesn't feel very different. It's kind of weird to say, but.
That's really cool though. I mean, that it's kind of just, it seems like at the core, the motivations are the same, and it's probably a good sign of what you're doing that it does feel similar versus like some of these, I've watched, content creators 10 years ago that, corporate ties, and they kind of lose the passion for it because it's like what started as a group of guys playing games together turned into like a group of guys who have big salaries arguing about what the content should be.
Yeah, and I think that, there's certainly a lot of pressures to being a content creator, but I think in our case, it's like, I think the reason the feeling hasn't changed is because we started this because what I saw is that there's a generation of people who are struggling with their mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories that I heard were kind of scary. Like people, the average age of a psychiatrist in the United States is over the age of 50.
Oh, wow.
People have to wait on average between 2 or 3 months. And, insurance doesn't cover things very well in terms of mental health care.
Yeah.
And so like reimbursement rates are low and things like that. So like clinicians are burnt out.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we really saw is that like people would go into a psychiatrist's office struggling with watching YouTube every day. They'd get prescribed an antidepressant and sent home. And I don't mean this as an indictment of my field, but what we really saw is that psychiatry was getting too slow, too expensive, and too old.
Mm.
That our ideas are not keeping up with the change in technology, the change in people's experiences.
Right.
And I think generally speaking, psychiatrists and clinicians are excellent people who do the best job that they can. But I think it's just the system is, and that's why mental health is getting worse. Like it's the only dimension of medicine that's like getting worse. Yeah. And something about our system is not able to keep up with it. And so our goal was to try to fix that or help. And we can't fix it, but we're going to try to whatever small thing that we can do to help.
Yeah.
Right. Instead of saying, oh, things are too old, too slow, and too expensive, we're going to actually like, instead of like criticizing on the sidelines, like, let's see if we can make a difference. And that's where we started. That was at the top of my mind, the first time I streamed on Twitch. It's at the top of my mind when I'm going to fly to TwitchCon tomorrow. Is like, how can I help people today? And people who are on board with that mission, they're the ones who end up working with us.
That's awesome. Yeah. So do you interview all these people yourself, or do you have a person who interviews them?
Oh, there's a whole process. So the one thing that I'm pretty attached to is that I want to be involved in the teaching of every coach.
Mm-hmm.
So their first 8 weeks when they're working with clients, I meet with them once a week.
Gotcha.
And just to make sure that so I can, personally teach them. But that's really the only, that and making the content are the two things that I'm, I have a hand in pretty much all the time.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, so one of the questions I ask everyone in these interviews, but I'm hesitant to ask you, is like long-term goals of their content. But obviously we've touched base on like the long-term goals are kind of not what motivate you. You're kind of just on this, take it one step at a time. But is there any like needs or like gaps in what you're doing that you might want to like expand into? Like, because I know recently you, in a video, I think you touched base on incorporating this into like school programs or expanding into that field.
Yeah. So I think to answer your question, what are my long-term goals for content? I hope to live in a world one day where I am no longer needed. That's my goal. That I don't need to explain to people how to meditate because everyone knows. So honestly, my long-term content goal is to no longer need to make content. That's the goal. I should be completely obsolete. And even in our coaching program, our goal in coaching is to have people leave, to come in and like figure out what's going on in your life, figure out the skills needed to make progress, apply that, internalize it, troubleshoot it for a little while, and then go live your life.
Mm-hmm.
In the short term, to kind of accomplish that sort of thing, what we're sort of noticing is that there are a lot of directions we can take content in. And one of the big things that we're really struggling with right now, I mean, struggling in the sense of where do we put our resources, is do we lean into things like relationships, which are more general and like communication skills? Or do we lean into things that are a little bit more clinical in nature, like addiction and trauma? And so on a month-to-month basis, it's kind of like, what do people need more? Do they need to understand how trauma affects a human being? Right? We're not talking about diagnosing and treating. We're saying like just on a general level, when something bad happens in your life, what happens to your brain? What happens to your mind? How do you recover from it? There's a lot of really interesting research on something called post-traumatic growth, for example, which is about like how, human beings can grow through bad experiences. This idea of what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And how cool would it be if like everyone understood how to, instead of winding up with PTSD, winding up in like a post-traumatic growth kind of period, because there is research on that. What would the world be like? And on the flip side, one of the things that we struggle with is like there are a lot of people who struggle to date in today's world.
Right.
And like communication is changing really, really rapidly. So like one of the most successful events that we have is something called Social Sandbox, which is when about 100 people, we had to increase the capacity because we could originally take 100. We'll show up on Discord and we'll just practice talking. Because as communication becomes more digital, just like you can learn, forget a foreign language that you don't use, some of our social skills begin to atrophy. And so like, that's been fantastic because people show up for a couple of weeks and then they feel comfortable talking again. And then they can go out and like interact with people at the grocery store and go to parties and things like that. So I think that there's a lot of, do we need to teach people like basic skills, or do we need to inform people more about, some of these things like addiction and technology usage and stuff like that? Because it's not quite clinical. It's like everyone, is going to click a second YouTube video once they go onto YouTube, right?
Right. Well, how do you inform those decisions? Are those just conversations within your organization, or is there somewhere you go to get data on what the needs are?
I mean, sometimes we'll get data, but oftentimes it's just like asking people, like our community. So like I'll ask Twitch chat, This is something that I do commonly, which is like, okay, there are 3 things we could talk about today. What do y'all want to talk about? And we also have like, a very vibrant subreddit and Discord community with like 70,000 people on it and things like that. So we'll sort of hear about what people are struggling with, because people will come and they'll say like, hey, here's what I'm struggling with. And so we've seen a lot of stuff recently around dating and relationships. So we're kind of thinking about doing stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I definitely resonate with that because I am completely remote for my work. And so this is my social interactions. I'll have time through Zoom, and so it is very sometimes strange even just going to the grocery store and doing that.
Yeah, man.
Especially with COVID and everything. And I don't even want to talk about dating, God.
Right? So when you ask, how do we know what content to make? That's how we know, Mike. Looks like, because I talk to people, right? And I mention dating, and what I get is, yeah, it's hard out there.
It is.
And it's like, okay, so like, what are we going to do about it? Like as a society, like how are we going to, because it's hard for everyone, which is what's so confusing. And the problem is that when you struggle in dating, you think it's you, right? There's got to be something wrong with me because it's hard. But no, it's like, this is a systemic thing. Like we're seeing, like there's data behind this. It's getting harder. And so we've got to figure out how to help people be more successful at dating.
Yeah, rather than just making a new dating app.
Right? So, the dating app folks are doing what they know how to do, which is like, we're going to make a new one.
Yeah.
And this is going to be, more successful than all the other ones because we've got a new algorithm. And who knows, maybe they'll figure it out. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. That is a tough one for sure. Do you watch Twitch? Do you watch YouTube? Like, or are you more of a like just post and try not to get too deep in that rabbit hole?
So I mean, I'm big into gaming, so I'll watch especially like tournaments and stuff. Like that stuff I'll consume pretty voraciously. I don't tend to keep up with a lot of like drama kind of stuff.
Right.
I mean, there's some stuff that I love watching like cooking videos and stuff on YouTube and stuff. Like there's a lot of great stuff out there. and some like nature-oriented things and like animal-related stuff and things like that. So like, I certainly am a connoisseur of sorts of the internet. But usually, especially on Twitch, it's like mostly like tournaments and esports.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting because I've noticed some people like a Mr. Beast, for example, spends 12 hours a day watching YouTube, and some people who create content, they just create the content and they never even look at the platform. So it's interesting to hear how different people approach it.
Yeah, so I would say that I try very hard to not make consuming content part of my job. So I'll do that part very intentionally, but generally speaking, I like to just enjoy it like any other user.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. K. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much for listening. I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Media U, and my producer, Natalie Roman. And if you're interested in staying tuned for more podcasts, feel free to follow us on YouTube, or you can catch us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.